Thank you for that introduction. Yes, I worked for the McLean County Museum of History. I've been there 20 plus years. As I always emphasize, we are nonprofit, right? My salary is not paid for by the County of McLean. We rent the glorious old courthouse building from the county, and we occupy that. So we take great pride in being a standalone nonprofit. So if you appreciate local history, we appreciate your support. I delivered a version of what you're going to hear tonight. It's dramatically different to the Lake Bloomington Association group back in 2017 over at Timber Point. So some of you were probably there, but there's going to be a lot of new information here. In the next 40 minutes or so, clearly there's way too much information, too many neat stories, too much ground to cover, I should say surface water to cover, right? But it's my modest goal to show some neat images and get people excited about our shared past, right? Local history, right? We're all in this together. So this program is heavily dependent on images. If you're having trouble seeing something, please scoot up a little bit because you're really going to miss out on kind of a lot of this program here because I'm going to be referring constantly to these images. So here's a Google Maps satellite view of Lake Bloomington, 635 acres or so, right? 18 and a half miles of shoreline, completed in 1930. Much can be discerned here on this map, and I hope there's not a glare issue or anything. The northwest reaches of the village of Hudson, right, are seen in the corner there. The Money Creek Inlet, right, the impoundment of Money Creek creates the lake we see here. Parklands foundation holdings are visible along the Mackinac River, as is the river itself. Clearly what dominates in addition to the lake is a landscape of cropland, right, interspersed with some fragmented timber. We can even see here, if you look closely, that bright spot is City of Bloomington Water Department flood ponds treated with lime. So there we have a good introduction to the topic at hand. This is a topographical surface map of the county of McLean, right? And the brighter colors are higher elevations. So what you're seeing here, that big line coursing through the heart of the county, is the Bloomington Moraine. It's the fourth largest moraine in the state of Illinois. It's at points about 100 feet higher than the surrounding terrain. It courses through northern and central Illinois in a wide arc. It was created during the last ice age, some 20 to 25,000 years ago, as the ice sheet was retreating, right? Where we're standing now is about a mile thick ice sheet, right? And as that sheet would halt periodically for decades or longer, right, a lot of ground up material would be pushed to the front of that ice sheet, deposited, the retreat would continue, and you'd be left with a ridge line, right? So this is the defining characteristic of our county, right? Elevation, moisture, standing water used to mean something in our culture and civilization, but we've laid so much concrete and asphalt and gravel that we tend to forget how important elevation and being high and dry used to be, right? Right there in the red box, that's the highest point in McLean County, right? So if you take Route 9 out to Gibson City along, along Route 9, look south, you'll see a kind of a radio tower. That's the highest point in the county, 955 feet elevation. Let's pair that with a watershed map of the county, and it's interesting, right, that the Bloomington Moraine creates what? Like a continental divide, if you will, a mini continental divide in our county. So everything north of the Bloomington Moraine, right, that blue shade, is Mackinac River watershed, right? Money Creek, 6 Mile Creek, things of that nature. Everything south, right, is going to flow into the Sangamon River. Obviously, all is flowing into the Illinois and then the Mississippi, and then we deposit all our phosphates and other nasty stuff into the Gulf of Mexico to create a massive dead zone, unfortunately, right? So, right, we have a continental divide because of this ridgeline right here. And in the south, we have Sugar, from left to right, Sugar, Kickapoo, and Salt Creek, right? And then inching up right here is the headwaters of the Sangamon River, right? One of the most historical, romantic, poetic rivers in American history because of its affiliation with Abraham Lincoln. The Sangamon River, New Salem and all of that, originates just north of Ellsworth, right? As a glorified drainage ditch. I always remind Lincoln scholars of that. We like to, at the McLean County Museum of History, remind people attending our programs, right, that the land we occupy today had been in the possession or occupation of numerous indigenous peoples going, what, all the way back 13,000 years ago to the Paleo-Indians. As that ice sheet retreated, right, and the megafauna moved in, right, who was following the megafauna like the mastodon? It was human beings, right? So settlement in this part of Illinois, present-day Illinois, stretches all the way back to some 13,000 years. It's a magnificent story, and we, being Euro-Americans, we are very recent visitors to the landscape, right? And after the Paleo-Indians, you get wave after waves of peoples, right? Rise and falls of cultures and ways of life, right? As you get increasing sophistication with agriculture. So the Woodland period and the Mississippians, and then during the historic period, the contact period, with the arrival of Euro-Americans. This area is settled permanently by whites in the early 1800s, 18 teens and 1820s. And the indigenous people here at the time were the Kickapoo primarily, though there were Delaware and Potawatomi as well. And they inhabited, right, and were active along the Mackinac River, as we're going to see in a moment, as well as the Money Creek and 6 Mile watersheds, and throughout the county, clearly. This is a really nice item we have in our climate-controlled archives. It's a record book created in the 1850s by the Land Office in St. Louis, but it's all based on the notes and maps of the original surveyors who came through this stretch of central Illinois in the early 1820s. So what becomes McLean County is first surveyed by federal surveyors in the early 1820s, township by township, section by section. You needed an efficient way, right, to sell indigenous lands to incoming settlers. So we have this remarkable book that gives you a window into what this landscape looked like pre-contact, prior to settlement. This is Lexington Township. We're not in Lexington Township, but I'm showing this for a reason, right? Here we see the Mackinac River coursing through the township. Present-day Lexington would be up here, right? And this kind of colored belt surrounding the Mackinac River is the wooded river valley. It's a belt of timber, the Mackinac timber, right? That defines the Mackinac River. Let's look a little bit closer. This map is 1822, 1823, and we see the surveyor identifies a Kickapoo town along the Mackinac River, and a little further south, the Delaware town. This was after the 1890 treaty that forcibly removed most Kickapoo from central Illinois, but some refused to go, right? In addition to a small settlement of Delaware. These Kickapoo would remain in central Illinois into the early 1830s until the Black Hawk War. So this general area, right, was inhabited at the time of settlement by a remarkable people, the unconquerable Kickapoo, very culturally conservative, very aggressive, protecting their lifeways, and they survive today. This is the Peter Folsom map. He was a later surveyor. This map dates to 1856. But what I like about it, it shows the timbered tracts of the county. So obviously we're in the east central Grand Prairie. So about 90% of present day McLean County was in tall grass prairie, intermittent wetland, soggy sloughs, right? A lot of water, very wet, tall grass prairie. But about 10% of the landscape was in timbered tracts, known as groves or timber, right? And settlement, early settlement, is going to cling to these timbered belts. In the western part of the county, that large timbered belt is Stouts Grove. Just south of downtown Bloomington would be Blooming Grove. The most famous grove today would be Funk's Grove, though only a part of that grove survives today. Cheney's Grove in eastern McLean County. This big belt here is the Mackinac Timber. Here we see the Money Creek Timber and 6 Mile Grove right here. So we see the beginnings, in a way, of Lakes Bloomington and Everglades. I have circled now in red the general location of what will become Lake Bloomington, right, circled in red. And because you're getting the impoundment of Money Creek, right, that Money Creek Valley was once one of the more beautiful stretches of the county because it was full of virgin timber. This is an 1895 plat, so we're jumping ahead. I've circled again in red the general area where we are today, Lake Bloomington. Notice all the schoolhouses, right? These are all schoolhouses. So each township at one time had 6 to 9 one-room schools because children literally had to be able to walk to school, right? And the rural reaches of the Corn Belt were much more populated back then as they are today, right? So I've circled in red again this general area. We know today as Lake Bloomington, but back in the late 19th century, this area had another name. The name was Hell's Bend. I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with that story. But during the latter part of settlement, this stretch of Money Creek mud flats and timber and scrub bush was said to be home to, quote, wild and woolly hellions who trapped in the timber, fished on the banks of the stream, and operated a still or two to make whiskey. So it was it was a rural neighborhood, right? But kind of an outlier, if you will. Dr. Silas Hubbard, his house is in Hudson. It's on the National Register of Historic Places at the north end of town. It's a classic, what's known as an I house, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa farmhouse, 2-story wood frame, symmetrical structure, sometimes with an addition on the back. That's the Hubbard home at the north end of Hudson. It was Silas Hubbard as a physician, as a country doctor, who was serving not only the village of Hudson, but the surrounding countryside, including Hell's Bend. His son Albert, who's much more famous, Albert Hubbard, born in 1856, grew up in Hudson, obviously, where his father was a physician. And Albert Hubbard then became a well-known writer, founder of the Roy Croft Press, which became an arts and crafts colony in upstate New York. It became, during the last decade of the 19th century and into the 20th century. One of the more well-known Americans, Albert Hubbard from Hudson. So let's go back to the Hell's Bend neighborhood, right? Generally speaking, the neighborhood, this rural pocket, would have included what's today Camp Piers, right? And as well as Parkland Foundation's Moon Preserve. The Hell's Bend timber, those folk that lived in the Hell's Bend timber stood in opposition to the much more, it was said, right, industrious Yankee farmers on the open prairie. So you had hardworking Yankee pioneer farmers, and you had more kind of Kentucky, Tennessee folk, right, in the timber tracts.
All right.
This sounds to me like red state, blue state, right? Because these groups clashed culturally, they clashed politically, they clashed economically, and they clashed over education issues, especially the prairie-dominated one-room school. So the folks in Hell's Bend said, "To hell with it, we're creating our own one-room school," which they did, and they called their school Hell's Bend School. Though, as the area became more civilized in the early 20th century, Hell's Bend School was renamed Pleasant Grove School. The most famous resident of Hell's Bend is this remarkable figure, Charles Buffalo Jones, born in 1844 in Hell's Bend. We know that because Dr. Silas Hubbard is there for the birth, right? And there's a great story about that, right? So Buffalo Jones, as he will be known, leaves for Kansas in 1866. 1 year after the Civil War, became a buffalo hunter, then a livestock entrepreneur, and was also a Wild West showman, but then became a proto-conservationist because he helped establish what were known as seed herds of American bison. And his story is featured a little bit in that recent Ken Burns series on the American bison, right? So establishing seed herds as the animal or the species was being wiped off the planet, right, ensured their survival into the 21st century. In 1905, he would return back to Hudson and Bloomington on occasion, though he was a well-known figure. So not long after he had left his position, he was game warden of Yellowstone National Park, if you can believe it. Buffalo Jones pays a visit to the Twin Cities, and he's interviewed by the Pantograph, and this is what he has to say. 1905, quote, "I remember the time shortly after leaving Bloomington when I used to shoot buffalo for 50 cents a head. There were millions of them all over the West, and for the crime of killing those noble animals then, I am seeking to atone for now by preserving them as best I can." So he was aware, right, of his own history and trying to make, as he says, amends. Okay, let's move on. The birth of Lake Bloomington in many ways, and it may seem a little odd, is this industrial landscape. The Chicago and Alton Railroad shops from the 1860s until the 1920s, probably the largest employer in the Twin Cities, right? The Chicago and Alton Railroad was a main line between Chicago and St. Louis, Bloomington roughly halfway. It's a good place to repair and maintain steam locomotives, which need a lot of work. And while you're there, you can also build and refurbish rolling stock, right? So at the time of a 1920 typhoid epidemic or outbreak at the shops, which will lead to the push to create a lake. At the time of this 1920 outbreak, that will kill about 24, 25 men in the shops here. 1920, there's about 1,200 skilled and semi-skilled craftsmen, right? Machinists, blacksmiths, tool and die makers, upholsterers, carpenters, painters, switchmen, brakemen, you name it, right? A city unto itself on the west side of Bloomington. So as I mentioned, the typhoid epidemic breaks out in 1920, And for city leaders and reformers and the business community, that will be a fire bell in the night. That will tell city leaders the time is now to construct, to pay for and construct a lake, because the epidemic was unnecessary. And we'll talk about that in a second. But let's go back just a second, right? McLean County is established in 1830 as a county, and then Bloomington is organized as the county seat, and the first lots are sold in the summer of 1831, right? And the economy really doesn't take off until the arrival of railroads in the early 1850s. But even early on, the big issue is a safe, dependable, palatable municipal water supply, and that would plague Bloomington throughout the 19th century. In fact, as early as the 1850s, none other than Jesse Fell, one of the founders of Normal, played an instrumental role in bringing the university to Normal and all of that, right? Jesse Fell in the 1850s, before the Civil War, was looking toward the Mackinac River as the answer to the water woes of the Twin Cities, right? So Lake Bloomington, which is constructed in the late 1920s, people have been thinking about that for quite a long time, right? The problem was, before the establishment of Lake Bloomington or its construction, local groundwater was highly mineralized, making it one of the hardest municipal water supplies in all of the state. And as Bloomington grew, the city struggled to pump enough water from a series of wells it had on the northwest side, right, to meet industrial and residential demand. Water shortages were common, especially in the drier summer months. So before Lake Bloomington, many residents struggled under what was really a dual water system. Many homes had a dual water system, right? They used the city's notoriously hard water for drinking and cooking, but for washing you had to use much softer water, which you would catch in cisterns. Here we see, I know you don't have to read the information, it's just for visual purposes, the report on epidemic of typhoid at Bloomington, 1920, by the Illinois Department of Public Health, because the Illinois Department of Public Health found that the local health director in the city of Bloomington was wholly unprepared for what was happening, right? Typhoid is caused by the bacterium Salmonella typhi, and contracted, as we know, when you often contracted when you drink contaminated water, right? And that's what happened here. The Chicago and Alton Railroad shops, to supplement the meager municipal water supply, also had what they called an industrial supply of water. And they pulled that from contaminated Sugar Creek, and they pulled that from a series of contaminated wells not far from the shops, right? So they had contaminated industrial water used for toilets, used for boilers, used for blacksmith slack tubs, and they had ostensibly clean municipal water for drinking, right? The problem was a faulty cross-connection valve, right? And a leaky valve, right? And tens and then dozens and then several hundred men and their family members then began to become sick, right? From January through March 1920, tainted water sickened about 800 Chicago and Alton shopmen and their family members, right? Many suffered intestinal ailments, severe diarrhea, and it was enough, right? Full-blown typhoid reached several dozen, and 24 to 25 men will die because of this, right? This tragedy led many to realize that the water problem was the single most important municipal question of the day, and it had been ignored for far too long, right? If you know your history of Bloomington, there's one general theme, right? It's the cheapness of the city. And sometimes the cheapness of its residents, right? When it comes to parks, when it comes to municipal improvements, right? And such was the case here, but after this tragedy, right, the time to act was now, right? So this is a 1927 report comparing the impoundment of the Mackinac River with the impoundment of Money Creek and the different supply, and what they called supply projects, right? Soft water reservoirs, right? This was one in a series of reports that were necessary to lay the groundwork for what we see out the windows right here. So the Association of Commerce, which was the forerunner to what's now the McLean County Chamber of Commerce, became active in this issue. And then later there was a committee of 14 comprised of business leaders as well as the mayors of both Bloomington and Normal and the council members of both Bloomington and Normal. But as we know, Normal will back out of this process in the late 1920s, or else this might be Lake something else, right? If Normal had a hand in it. The goal, of course, of all this work, right, was to improve the quality, the quantity, and the reliability of Bloomington's water supply. Eventually, the powers that be selected a site, the Money Creek Valley, north of Hudson, and in 1927, the Association of Commerce organized a company for the purpose of the construction of, as I said, a soft water reservoir. This would be a turnkey project in that once completed, the city would assume ownership and the debts of the project, but it would be managed and taken care of and financed by a group of business leaders, some of whom were probably making a pretty penny off the sale of land, right? But that's a story for another day, right? All of this work, though, was made possible, and here we pat the Bloomington voter on the back through passage in September 1928 of a city referendum. And it passed. I think there was about 6,000 to 7,000 votes all told, and it passed by a margin of about 1,000 votes. So there was strong support in 1928 to pay for it, to assume the cost of the construction of a reservoir. Around $1 million in bonds were raised, financed by a group of Chicago bankers. That $1 million adjusted for inflation would be about $17 million today. So in the late 1920s, 28, 29, construction of the lake commenced. Today, of course, when you're taking a boat ride on the lake, you're really over what was once a wooded serpentine valley on the Illinois Prairie. So by the spring and summer of 1929, an estimated 40 to 50,000 trees have been removed from Money Creek Valley. It was one of the, if not the largest logging projects in the history of the county, right? So often when you build human-made reservoirs, right, you're losing the natural landscape. Some trees, though, in the Money Creek Valley were saved. C.E. Hill, who was Bloomington Park's custodian, transplanted 75 trees from the Mackinac timber to Miller Park. Hackberries and fir, pin, and white oaks. And I don't know, right, if the story of any of those trees. And we know from news reports that some residents flocked to the valley before it became wildflowers so they could transplant them in their yards and gardens. So let's hope today, right, part of the Mackinac River Valley survives in yards here and there throughout the Twin Cities and perhaps around the lake as well. Wonderful photograph of the construction of the lake. Here's the dam. Here's the pumping station right here under construction. A photo by Scoop, the pantograph from the late 20s to the early 40s, had a news plane, believe it or not. Actually, there were 4 news planes over that period, but they were all named Scoop. Note here, with my red dot, that's the meandering Money Creek right here. So before it was inundated, right? North of Hudson, so west of here, right, the Illinois Central Railroad opened an 860-foot long siding or switch track to offload materials such as dry cement, and from there it was a 4.5-mile truck trip along a newly gravelled road to the construction site, right? The Illinois Central Railroad used to run through Hudson on its way to LaSalle, Peru. That does not exist anymore. But this project was so important that the railroad had to build a siding to move construction materials the 4.5 miles to the lakeside. And believe it or not, there was also a narrow gauge railroad that was constructed, a temporary railroad to pull heavier supplies that the trucks could not carry. And this narrow gauge railroad was pulled by gasoline powered little locomotives called dinkies, right? There's the spillway under construction. We see a piece of dredging equipment right there, a crane in 1930. The 50-foot dam, the initial dam, the 50-foot dam, at the time it was said that it was, quote, shaped like an inverted sugar beet. I didn't really know what to make of that. Sometimes you're just baffled. Fabulous photograph. This is the construction of the lake, right? There's Money Creek. Dredging equipment, if you look closely, that's the Ohio Power Shovel Company of Lima, Ohio. So here's the announcement for the opening of the lake, officially dedicated August 1930, timed with the McLean County Centennial Jubilee. McLean County, established 1830, celebrating 100 years in 1930. We're also dedicating and opening the lake in 1930, right? But earlier that year, in March of 1930, the first water from the new Lake of Bloomington reached the city reservoir on West Division Street. So the lake really is successful, passes its first important mark in March or the spring of 1930. E.M. Evans, who was president of the Bloomington Water Company, had this to say at the dedication, quote, "The city has experienced 100 years of hard water, hard work, and sometimes hard times. Here's hoping the next 100 years will be much softer." And this was an illustration of the lake that ran in the centennial edition of the Pantograph, celebrating the county centennial on August 26, 1930. And the headline there is, "Coming years should witness resolutions of all lakes possibilities," right? Possibilities not only when it comes to a dependable municipal water supply, but what? Public recreation, right? So here we see boats on the lake. Here's a dance hall, park grounds where we are. To indicate the modern era, right? We have somewhere we can see electric lines running. Yeah, right along here. Telephone lines, the airplane, right? This is a modern, convenient lake where those in Bloomington Normal, right, can come and enjoy a weekend or take a swim. This is a McLean County Association of Commerce, the predecessors to the Chamber of Commerce, an undated aerial, right? Luckily, the powers that be, with a nudge from civic-minded folk, agreed to set aside, as we know, significant amount of shoreline for what? Public-spirited endeavors. And from that foresight, we get the Boy Scouts Camp Heffernan, which is today Easter Seals Timber Point Outdoor Center, as well as the now closed Girl Scout Camp Piers and the lovely East Bay Camp, right? And a lovely aerial view of the lake, which then a postcard company took this image and made it into a vivid color photograph. That company was C.T. Kurt Tyke. It was a famous Chicago postcard manufacturer known for these outrageously colored postcards. So keep your eye here. We're going to see this transform into a Kurt Tyke postcard. Hopefully they got permission from the Chamber of Commerce, right? Because they're using their image there. So I'm really proud of this, so I want to show it to you. I'm not very tech savvy, but, and I just stumbled upon this as I was doing research for this program, looking at all the wonderful images we have of Lake Bloomington. I just don't have time, unfortunately, to show them all. And another, again, lovely aerial view, early view of the lake. Here's the construction of the first Davis Lodge, or the reconstruction, obviously. And here we see a finished pump house, right? So really, and notice some timber was saved, right? So they did have the foresight again to save some of the timber along the shoreline. We see that here. And these are enlargements from the previous image. So here we see the pump house and the Davis Lodge. We can even see the clarifier basins, the early clarifier basins right there as they filter the water. And here's a lovely architectural rendering, a view of the pump house and water plant. The architectural firm was the successor to Arthur Pillsbury, A.L. Pillsbury. So that it was a group of architects, Lundin, Houghton, Grusin, and Schaefer, but it was really Archie Schaefer and Philip Houghton who worked on this magnificent pump house, which was done in a Spanish Mediterranean theme, because I thought that would fit well with the look of the shoreline. And I think that even holds true today. So Archie Schaefer and Philip Houghton also did much of the State Farm Insurance Company downtown building, among many other projects, right? And again, this image, this architectural rendering from the Pillsbury firm was taken by the Tyke Postcard Company and made into a vivid color postcard. When the lake opened, there was a 24-inch force main which ran south for 14 miles all the way to Bloomington, where it connected to the city reservoir on Division Street. There's a nice water's edge view of the pump house. Clearly today, the water treatment plant includes several additional buildings. There was a 1986 expansion that doubled the plant's capacity, right, to handle 24 million gallons a day. And then a new clarifier building was completed around 2000. There's an enlargement of the view we just saw. Notice the rusting dredging crane right there. And the city has done a wonderful job in the past year or two in really refurbishing, renovating what had been in poor shape, which is a memorial gate to that country physician living in Hudson, Dr. Silas Hubbard. They've really done an outstanding job of renovating and repairing that. And these are photographs from 2023 provided to me after the restoration work was completed. And there's the bas relief memorial to Dr. Hubbard, family doctor throughout this region, 1855 to 1900. This is an older photograph taken several years ago, and I just learned, right, that the city has cleaned up this bench, removed all the poison ivy. This used to be a thicket of poison ivy. It's a curious little ornamentation, as we were saying. There are a lot of curious things and little pockets of history you will bump into if you don't know it on the grounds right around us. What's the story here? It's known as the Melville Stone Elbert Hubbard Bench. And there's language on the bench, right? Money Creek Valley was their boyhood playground. Whose, right? Melville Stone, who grew up in Hudson and became the founder of Associated Press, right? Which still survives today as one of the most important news gathering outfits in the world, not only North America, right? And the other would be Albert Hubbard, the son of Dr. Hubbard, who became a well-known writer and the founder of this really curious, eclectic, and eccentric arts and crafts colony in upstate New York, known mostly for their book publishing, but other things as well, including furniture. And you have both the Roycrofters arts and crafts symbol and the AP logo right on the bench as well. So really, on a cement bench, stone bench, you got a lot of local history. This is a nice item we have in our collection, and if any of you collect Lake Bloomington ephemera, you might have this booklet written by Albert Hubbard's daughter, sister, Mary Hubbard Heath, in 1931, A Modern Miracle. What's a modern miracle? Lake Bloomington. Because this booklet recounts 1870 when there was a deep, dusty drought and Money Creek was just kind of a sandy bed, right? And Mary Hubbard Heath is comparing 1870, right? When people were thirsty and dry, right? To this glorious lake we see in front of us, right? The kind of the advances we're making in society, a celebration of that, this modern miracle. The Davis Lodge. We can't leave without talking about the Davis Lodge, right? Named for Hibbard Osborne, H.O. Davis, an editor-publisher of the Pantograph, not Judge David Davis of 8th Circuit fame, right? That's a common misconception, right? Dedicated in 1932, raised in 1990, in the 1990s because it was in rather deplorable shape thanks to termites and other things. But the two stone fireplaces were left and then reopened, rebuilt in 2002. And I believe the architect who had a big hand in it was Russell Francois of Bloomington, right? So really a respectful, well done tribute to what was here before. And all of this timber was logged off of this site here, right? The original lodge. Urban legend holds that either the lake or the original lodge, or both, were the product of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Great Depression New Deal, one of the alphabet agencies, like the WPA or the Civilian Conservation Corps. That, as we know now, is not true, right? This was a privately funded, locally funded endeavor, right? So this was not kind of a story of the New Deal, like, for example, the wonderful lodge at Starved Rock State Park is, right? That's Civilian Conservation Corps. We don't have that story at least told in this part of the county. Nice interior shot of the original lodge being built. And as we see out here out the window, right, the lodge was located here. One reason was it looks out or overlooks the widest expanse of the 635 or so acre lake. There's an enlargement. This was around the time of its dedication and opening. And really a lovely early aerial of the lake, right? Right after it had reached full pool, you see how little development there is along the lake, right? So we can compare and contrast that to the left of the 1930 to a contemporary Google Maps satellite view and see development and how that has changed the tenor of the lake. This is East Bay without water in April 1956, 11 feet below the spillway, right? As we know, if you live around Lake, you know a lot better than I do, droughts, lake siltation, growing population of Bloomington through the decades, right? Always contributed to this call for a second reservoir for the city of Bloomington, that Lake Bloomington would be inadequate to meet future demands, recreation demands as well on the flat, relatively featureless Corn Belt countryside, right? So the end result was the construction of initially a $5 million, 700-acre, 4.2 billion gallon reservoir through the impoundment of 6 Mile Creek to the west of where we are right now. Groundbreaking, we see a photograph here, April 27, 1968. On that date, Bloomington Mayor Robert McGraw announced the lake's name. Prior to that, it had been known as 6 Mile Lake because of the impoundment of 6 Mile Creek. But he announced the name after a naming contest as Evergreen. Bloomington used to be nicknamed the Evergreen City. You don't really hear that much anymore. It used to be much more common. So Evergreen Lake really owes its name to a nickname for the city of Bloomington. Why Evergreen with Lake following Evergreen as opposed to Lake Bloomington, where the article, the, and the noun are reversed? I don't know why that's the case. If anybody knows why they're named such, please let me know. There's a view of the spillway. The construction of Lake Evergreen was made possible through a $2 million general obligation bond approved by, again, the city residents. When first completed, the lake's dam featured a 60-foot spillway that required some 19,000 yards of poured concrete. During its planning and early construction phase, Evergreen was first called, as I said, 6 Mile Lake. So then you had the contest, then you had it named Evergreen Lake. But I wanted to know, what were some of the other suggestions, right? Because Evergreen is a nice name, but it's a little bland, right? There's a lot of Lake Evergreens. One suggestion was Stevenson Lake. Another was Adlai Lake. Both, obviously, for Adlai E. Stevenson II, Bloomington's favorite son. Another suggestion was the Land of Lincoln Lake. How about the David Davis Lake? Twin Lake, I guess the twin would be Lake Bloomington, right? And then Lake Sesquicentennial. Lake Sesquicentennial. Because 1968 was the sesquicentennial, or the 150th anniversary of the state of Illinois. Well, it was Evergreen. So impoundment began January 11, 1971, and officials thought that they would reach full pool, or 715 feet above sea level, in about 2 years' time. But because of the rainfall, they were able to reach that mark in a year's time, almost to the day. They reached full pool in January of 1972. The new lake, of course, included the pumping station and a $500,000 water main of 30-inch ductile iron pipe running from Evergreen Lake to Lake Bloomington's purification plant. And that water main runs, of course, parallel to what? Lake Bloomington Road, which connects the two lakes. This is a real, I wish you could see some of the details here. This is a 1972 fanciful, maybe, or very ambitious plan for the recreation potential of Camp Lara, right? The county-managed grounds of Evergreen Lake. So as we know, although the lake is owned by Bloomington, a long-term lease agreement gives the county of McLean authority to plan and develop and operate the lake and surrounding shoreline and natural areas, including even the section poking into Woodford County. So for more than 4 decades, Kamlara Park, right, an acronym of County of McLean Lake and Recreation Area, Kamlara, has remained the hub of Evergreen Lake activities. And after a series of delays, the public beach opened in August of 1975. But this report, or this study from 3 years earlier, envisioned a much more ambitious 2,000 148-acre park with not one but 2 beaches, with an ecological research center, with a riding stable and riding trails, and get this, an operating, working, historic pioneer farm. How cool would that be to have that out at the lake today, right? But funding always gets in the way of dreams. Reality always gets in the way, right? So the plans for Kamlara Park and the recreation potential of the lake has been scaled back somewhat or considerably, depending on your view. Here's another really nice item we have in our collection, both in our archives and in our library. Some of you may have a copy of this from 1975. It's a trail booklet for Shady Hollow Nature Trail at Kamlara Park, put together by the great late Dr. Dale Birkenholtz, right, the ecologist at Illinois State University. I'm sure some of you knew Dr. Birkenholtz. But it was also put together by Howard Davis, who was head of curriculum for Unit 5. So I think this really speaks to the optimism and the ambition of the period when the lake opened, that this was going to be, right, this kind of wonderful, not only recreation opportunity, but educational opportunities for Unit 5, for school children, right, to bring them out there and get them into contact with nature. And I think we've lost a little bit of that, right, a little bit of that urge to do that, right? And again, that might be a matter of just funding and cash-strapped school districts. A view of the lake in its early history in the summer of 1975. So I'll wrap up with this, right? So in the mid-1990s, officials raised the height of the dam at Evergreen Lake to add some 225 additional acres of water. That increased capacity was deemed necessary to ensure Bloomington's long-term access to safe and dependable drinking water. What could be more important to a community than that, right? You look at sewage, garbage disposal, and potable water, right? All of that has to happen before anything else can happen. So today, Evergreen Lake is now about 925 acres and offers some of the best fishing and nature photography and boating and camping if not central Illinois, in much of downstate Illinois. So you folks have been patient, really wonderful. Thank you so much. If anyone has a question